They arrived quietly, unannounced and understated, hanging patiently from the common hackberries of Serenity Falls. No one knows who put them up, or when for that matter. So subtle was their appearance that, by the time anybody noticed the strange posters on Wilt Avenue, the low-quality printer paper had already become waterlogged, black ink bleeding into empty space like fungus on a branch and a green-orange bloom of rust forming across the cheap thumbtacks which pinned each notice to its tree. I wish they'd never received the attention they did. I wish we'd all simply passed them by, until the rain and snow soaked the stock into shreds of wadded tissue, smudging the text into pools of gray mush, degrading its structure until they slipped from their pins and fell to the ground. Harmless mulch. Dead words decomposing on a wet sidewalk. Suffice to say, that isn't how this story ends. It was earlier in the month, November 3rd I think, when someone, somewhere passed by the modest black and white posters and, presumably following a quick double take, circulated a grainy picture on one of the town's message boards. Our ever-dwindling online community is propped up on the industry of small business owners, farmers, yard sale enthusiasts and bored parents, the latter of whom started sharing the picture around almost immediately. Which one of you thought of this? On Shetland Street too. Took a flyer in front of Archie this morning. New elf on the shelf. Someone should take these down. I didn't comment, personally. I'm a long way from being a parent. I'm actually not sure I want kids all that much, but I still spend a lot of time on these parenting forums. I've been babysitting other people's children for a few years now. It's pretty chill, gives me time to do homework and writing, and it's one of the rare jobs available for 11 to 15-year-olds in Serenity Falls. As someone on the more senior end of that spectrum, I've had a few years to make a name for myself. Sarah Jennings, babysitter extraordinaire, more reliable than an older sibling, easier to kick out than a mother-in-law. I was halfway through posting my availability in the odd jobs section, looking to land a few gigs in the lead up to the holiday season, when my egregious attention span deflected me towards the aforementioned post. It was easily the busiest chain on an otherwise deserted message board. 998 comments, 74% liked, a range of opinions roughly 70/30ths in favor of these strange, black and white posters. The unexpanded image was kinda shitty, and I didn't care enough to open it up at the time. Briefly scanning over it however, as I made my way back to the other tab, I was able to make out the poster's key phrase, at the very top, scrawled in black Sharpie, much larger than anything around it. Bad man's home. A few days later, I got to see the notice in person. I was heading to a regular babysitting job, the Sullivan household on Wilt Avenue. Mr. Sullivan is one of the few adults who has my number in his phone, largely due to the fact that he's a single father whose place of work is prone to late-night meltdowns. Mr. Sullivan's kid, a 7-year-old named Charlie, is super cute but undoubtedly a handful. Where a lot of kids nowadays can sink themselves into a tablet for 3 or 4 hours without coming up for air, Charlie would probably end up using it as a frisbee. He spends every waking moment running through the house, jumping down the stairs, crawling under tables, wielding an imaginary sword to save an imaginary friend from an imaginary foe. My job is to watch him bounce off the walls until he tires himself out, keeping him off the furniture and making sure he doesn't get near the knives. I was actually looking forward to seeing him, as I walked down Wilt Avenue, awkwardly fishing some headphones out of my backpack. When I was about 3 houses down, I saw a white rectangle of weathered paper hanging against the trunk of one of Serenity Falls' hackberry trees, the last tree before Mr. Sullivan's house. Immediately recalling the rather hysterical forum post from a few days before, I kept my eyes on it as I drew closer, the words, "Bad man's home," coming quickly into view. After approaching a little further, I stopped walking, and examined the poster in full view. Bad man's home * he has come. Here winter long. To take misbehaved and cruel. Take a number. Call if boys and girls. * is bad is cruel breaks or hits. No tree for presents. No chimney for toys. No returns once took. Boys and girls kept. The bottom of the poster had been cut into little strips of paper. Each one had the same cell phone number scrawled messily along it, ending in 0026. That was it. Nothing special, nothing world-ending. Just some Babadookie, Krampusy boogeyman that a random parent had put up in the run-up to Christmas. Whoever had done it, they'd made the poster look like it was written by some kind of monster, jagged, uneven letters, and the stilted syntax of something with only a vague grasp of human language. I have to admit it wasn't bad work. I could imagine the strips at the bottom being torn from the sheets around town, brandished by impatient mothers at their misbehaving children, the number half dialed by beleaguered fathers in a bid to quell their kids' tantrums. On this poster alone, 4 strips had already been torn off. I wasn't so sure it sat well with me, as I knocked on Mr. Sullivan's door and heard his footsteps from the hall. But, then again, I only have these kids for an evening a week. Parenting is a full-time job, and I'd learned early on that I was in no position to judge. A Santa here, a boogeyman there. I guess these things existed for a reason. Hey Sarah, thanks for coming, I know it's short notice. Mr. Sullivan appeared at the door quickly, putting his jacket on as soon as it opened. Charlie's in the living room, and there's money for you to order food on the table. No worries at all, thank you. Okay, I'll be back around the normal time, but I'll give you a call when I'm on my way. He smiled as we changed places, calling back through the door as he rushed out down the steps. Charlie, be good for Sarah, okay? Curiously, Charlie didn't reply. In fact, the house was unusually silent. No hammering footsteps on hardwood, no unintelligible battle cries from down the hall. I noticed a flicker of concern on Mr. Sullivan's face as he crossed the sidewalk and climbed into his car. As I walked into the living room, the faint sound of some kid's TV show rose through the silence. A team of superheroes were fighting across Mr. Sullivan's 4K setup, each member sporting a primary color and battling for the planet Earth in the middle of a quarry. Charlie was sitting on the opposite sofa, bathed in the glow of the screen. Despite it being his favorite type of show, he didn't look at it once, his eyes staring off into one dark corner of the room. Something was up. By this point, on any normal day, Charlie would have already greeted me with a hug, and be sprinting up the stairs on all fours, intent on fighting evil on every piece of furniture he could find. The Charlie before me wasn't just still, he was keeping still. A conscious lack of movement, the kind that takes effort to maintain. Instead of letting his feet dangle down from the sofa, kicking rhythmically against the leather like normal, his knees were tucked up against his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around his legs. His guard was up, and whatever shadowy force he feared, it was clearly too powerful for his sword and shield to handle. Hey Charlie, are you okay? He didn't answer. Instead he looked up at me silently, then back to the corner of the dark room with a sense of fearful vigilance. As soon as I sat down, he immediately latched onto me, tightly and wordlessly, as if I was the last rock before the waterfall. His eyes never wavered, however, remaining fixed on that dark point in space, paying it his unflinching attention. Once my eyes were able to adjust, I saw what he was staring at, a small side table and, resting on top of it, a cordless landline phone. We sat there for almost an hour. Any questions I asked ran into a wall of silence, struggling uselessly to get any purchase on his mumbled, one-word answers. I'd almost given up entirely when, in the dancing light of the TV, he turned his attention away from the phone and, for the first time, towards me. Sarah, what's a femur? He asked quietly, under his breath, as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. Where did you hear that? Again, no answer. It's a bone in your leg. It's the thigh bone, I replied, lifting one of my legs up to the couch, and pointing. Charlie held in space for a moment, pulling back into himself, in the same way an ocean recedes before a tidal wave wrecks the shore. Seconds later, the steadily crescendoing air raid siren of a child's cry filled the room, an unchecked river of tears streaming from Charlie's eyes. I felt his grip tighten, latching onto me even harder, as if he were scared that letting go would cause him to fall sideways into the dark corner of the living room, never be heard from again. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the night, but he kept me by his side the entire time, his hand only letting go of mine when he finally drifted off to sleep, later in the evening. I never learned why he'd asked that question, or what he'd heard to make my answer so deeply distressing to him. I had to admit though, the kid was better behaved than I've ever seen him, and, in some ways, that's what concerned me the most. A week later, new posters went up. I'd already heard about it as I made my way down Wilt Avenue to the Sullivan house. The reaction to the posters was decidedly cooler than it had been a week prior, but it was still a definite talking point among the parenting community, of whom a small handful had, in some way or another, employed the posters with their children. TBF, they're being super well behaved now. Did other people try? Didn't expect the call to go through. I never called it. Don't know why anyone would. I think this is worth telling Sergeant Weiss about. I'm taking them down wherever I see them. This is not funny. The next time I visited Mr. Sullivan's house, I made a point to check on the latest edition. The poster was only about 3 days old this time, not nearly as worn as their predecessors. Bad man's home he is choosing. Expect him and behave. Answer his call. No doors here. No windows. No running on broken things. The vague sense of threat was elevated now, or perhaps the opposite, more grounded. The statements made across these new posters seemed less like the ramblings of a fairy tale monster and more like the threats of a deeply disturbed individual. Suffice to say, no one had taken a number this time. When Mr. Sullivan answered the door, I could tell he looked worried. He greeted me distractedly, making idle small talk as he made his way out the door. Stepping quickly down onto the sidewalk, he briefly turned back to me. If anyone. He searched to find the words, but decided to call it off halfway through. Instead, he just looked at me, a pained expression on his face, and simply said, "Thank you for looking after him tonight." I smiled, nodded and shut the door. Turning around, I was greeted to a vision of Charlie, sitting quietly on the stairs, waiting for me. Not much happened for the first half of the night. We brought the big box of Legos up to his bedroom and started building spaceships. There a powerful quiet to his demeanor. Even when he managed to say more than a single word, it was always under his breath, solemnly, looking down at his creations. Mine doesn't look very aerodynamic, I said, holding the intentionally shitty Lego ship in front of him after an hour or so of building. Can you help me make it better? It's okay. They're getting built in space. Charlie mumbled, going back to his work. Oh okay, then maybe I'll add some. A noise cut across the silence, barreling up the stairs from the living room and piercing through the door. As soon as it reached our ears, Charlie finally looked up, his eyes awash with total, mind-gripping fear. Someone was calling the landline. After a few rings, Charlie sprang to his feet and bolted towards the door. I caught him a little as he went, stopping him as gently as possible, but I could immediately feel him starting to struggle against me, increasingly distressed with every passing moment. Charlie, what's wrong? We have to pick up the phone. Sarah, we have to pick up the phone, we need to. Hey. It's okay. Let's just see who it is. We'll go together, okay? I took Charlie's hand, as he pulled me all the way down the stairs and into the living room. By the time we reached the phone, the call had ended. Just as I was about to turn away, the blue screen of the phone lit up, and the ringing began once more. I felt Charlie's hand clench my fist as I read the incoming number. It was from a cell, ending in 0026. I didn't want to answer, but the phone just kept ringing. Again, and again, and again. Every time it stopped, we had only a brief moment to wait before the ringing filled the room once more. In the same way that a word that you've said too often starts to lose its meaning, the ring tone almost seemed to change as we listened to it loop over and over, its banal tone fading away, replaced by something eerie and sinister, the constant wailing whine of an uninvited guest. Let me in, let me in, let me in, let me in. You have to answer or it won't stop. Charlie whimpered, after the number called a seventh time. Has this number called before? I looked down at him, the phone hailing us with sickening patience. Dad called it and then they called back and he talked on the phone and yelled, but they didn't say who they were and they said they were going to. He spoke quickly, a runaway train of thought that had dropped back into his mind when he could no longer bring himself to say the words out loud. Even as he stopped talking, I could tell the thought was continuing on, running through his brain, prompting a fresh bout of tears to escape. Through it all, the phone kept ringing. Turning away from Charlie, gripping his hand tightly, I snatched up the receiver and accepted the call. For a moment, when I put it to my ear, all I could hear was deep, low breathing. The voice was unimaginably low, grating and deep, as if they words were being dragged over gravel on their way toward me. The two words were spoken with a bristling anger, an impatient demand. If Charlie had heard this voice before, then it was no wonder he'd been terrified of the phones in this house. No, you're talking to me. I squeezed Charlie's hand, hoping to project the confidence I didn't feel myself. I want you to stop calling. I don't want you to call this house again. The line went silent for just a moment. A choice has been made. No toys. No running. The misbehaved come home. Fuck you. Using the momentum of my own anger, I slammed the phone down, hanging up the call. It didn't ring again. Even though line was dead, the voice's presence remained in the room, hanging over us both. I put Charlie on the couch and marched over to the windows, drawing the curtains. What did it say? Charlie asked, his voice quivering. Nothing, I responded, as I walked back over to the couch. The night went by uneasily. I tried to comfort Charlie as much as I could, but I think he knew how deeply disturbed I'd been by the incident. I think he saw that I was as worried as him. I waited in the kitchen, even after Mr. Sullivan came back. Caught between a strong reluctance to walk home alone, and a complete refusal to leave Charlie in the house without me or his father, I'd called my parents for company on the way back. "Did you eat dinner?" Mr. Sullivan asked, concerned. "No. Do you want anything before your parents get here?" "Mr. Sullivan, did you call the number on those posters outside?" I don't know if it's because of the latent anger in my voice, or simply the complete left-field nature of my inquiry, but I saw Mr. Sullivan's eyes darken. "Did someone call?" I let my silence answer his question, and waited for him to answer mine. Mr. Sullivan took a pained, reluctant breath. He kept running off, all day, at the store, on the way home. I couldn't keep up with him. I had work to do. I'd seen the posters around, so I took a flyer just to. I thought some parent put them up, you know. Some spooky, morality tale before Christmas. The next day he was climbing on the furniture and I pretended to dial the number and he looked embarrassed, but I don't have time for him to wallow. My mom was only a few streets away and I still didn't understand what was happening. Pretended. Yeah, that's the thing. Mr. Sullivan looked at me, fear in his eyes. Reluctant as he sounded, he also spoke as if it had been torture keeping all this to himself. "I have never called that number. I didn't even dial, I just held the phone to my ear and..." Mr. Sullivan looked down, dreading the question he was about to ask. What did he say? I could see the fear in his eyes. He was worried for his son, terrified. I didn't want to tell him what the man on the phone said to me. The idea of reciting the insidious threat felt physically repulsive. He said a choice has been made. He said that the misbehaved come home. Mr. Sullivan stayed silent for a moment, before muttering, "I never meant for..." The doorbell rang, making me jump a little and causing him to stop mid-sentence. I had a feeling he was grateful for the interruption. My mom had arrived to walk me home. I left Mr. Sullivan behind, not sure what I could say to the man to make him feel better. As soon as I made it down the front steps and onto the street to where my mother was waiting to collect me, I remember feeling a distinct chill running across the back of my neck, a shiver that cooled my very being as we made our way back down the darkened street. I told myself it was merely a byproduct of the biting winter wind that had drifted into town that night, but as me and my mom turned the corner from Wilt Avenue, and the Sullivan house fell out of view, I distinctly felt the sensation ebb away. It was something else then, a subtle mix of paranoid anxiety and fear, which traveled with me along that street, and that street alone. Deep down, I knew exactly why I'd felt that way. When I'd picked up the phone earlier that night, and held it to my ear, the figure on the other end had demanded to talk to the boy. Those two sharp syllables kept ringing in my mind, even after Charlie had passed into some uneasy semblance of sleep, and I'd finally left Wilt Avenue behind. The thing on the phone had been the first one to speak. It had no way of knowing that the call hadn't been picked up by Charlie, that I'd intercepted it instead. Unless something could see us. Unless something was watching the Sullivan house. Okay, whoever's behind this, you need to stop. This has gone beyond a joke. Our girl is terrified. I'm calling Sergeant Weiss when I get home from work. Please someone stop this, it's a prank. Just don't answer when they call. Didn't see Charlie before the posters changed again. I'd taken a bit of a break from babysitting after the events of the previous week. Mr. Sullivan triggered that particular decision when he called me up a few days later, canceling my next 2 jobs with him. I think I'm going to just work from home for a week or 2, he said, soberly down the phone. I'm sorry, I just want to keep an eye on things. I could understand why. The forum post was slowly thinning down, now solely populated by the 2 or 3 sets of parents who had actually taken flyers from the sinister notices. However, as those without a stake in the game drifted from the conversation, the remaining comments grew more hysterical than ever. They spoke about receiving calls at all hours of the night, feeling like they were being watched as they walked their children into school, hearing someone move around outside their homes, knocking on doors, passing by windows. Whatever this was, it had moved far beyond a joke. The final few parents left on the comment thread started to discuss using their sick days, staying home with their kids, or passing them off to grandparents who lived out of town. I don't know whether they followed through with their ideas. I dropped off the message board shortly after, believing my part in the whole ordeal was over. Last night I discovered otherwise. It was 11:03. I was in bed, trying to pull myself away from the harsh, hypnotic glow of my phone screen and chase an elusive, uneasy sleep. Suddenly everything went dark, the backlight of my phone turning black except for two expectant circles, one red, one green, and the number of an incoming caller. A number ending in 0026. I felt my throat drop into the pit of my stomach. I stared at the number for almost a minute, my heartbeat quickly outpacing the phone's rhythmic shuddering, before I realized it wasn't going to stop. So far, my involvement with these strange events had been indirect, partial, merely the result of my being in the wrong place in the presence of those at the center of the being's dark lens. Now, I was at home, alone, and the call was meant for me. With a quivering hand, I reached out and slowly led the green circle to the other side of the screen. That same deep breathing, a noise I hoped I'd never have to hear again, drifted through the phone. What do you want?" I asked, anxious for the answer yet treasuring every second that the man chose not to reply. When he finally answered, he said only 2 words. "He's home." After that, the line went dead. For the briefest moment I lay paralyzed, held firm by that dark, dreadful admission. The next moment, I was up, throwing the covers aside, switching out my thermal pajamas for a pair of jeans and an old jacket. As I burst out of my room into the dark corridor, I screamed for my mom to wake up. My voice broke and shuddered as I spoke, a pressurized cry of worry and terror erupting from within me in one desperate syllable. I could tell she'd heard it in my voice. I could hear her rushing out of bed and up to the door. "Sarah, what is it? What's wrong?" she half whispered, as she emerged from the dark bedroom, pulled from the edge of sleep into a dark hallway, needing a moment to adjust to the waking world. I didn't know what to say in response. I didn't have a plan, or the time to explain myself. Instead, all I could bring myself to say was, "I need a ride to the Sullivans." I told her everything I knew on the drive over. As strange as the chain of events sounded, she seemed to believe me. I guess she'd noticed I hadn't been myself lately. Halfway through the story, she pulled her work phone from the glove box and handed it over, telling me to call the cops. We got there about 5 minutes later. Wilt Avenue was lit up for Christmas, red and blue dancing across the street as we made our way toward the Sullivan household. Felt a sensation vaguely resembling relief upon seeing that the cops had gotten there before us. We pulled up a little further down the street, our view of the Sullivan house obscured by a slowly gathering crowd of concerned neighbors. As soon as the wheels ground to a halt, I threw open the door and started to climb out. My mom briefly tried to stop me, a single look between us causing her to leave me be. When I stepped out and began to storm down the sidewalk, I heard the driver's side door open and shut behind me, my mom quickly following in my wake. Forcing my way towards the gathering crowd, my heart in my throat, I found myself marching in the direction of the Hackberry, its dark trunk mockingly displaying one of the latest posters, the words obscured by an alternation of dark shadow and the disorienting lights of the idling cop car. I tore the crisp white page from its shiny new thumbtack without breaking stride, crumpling it up as I pushed through the crowd and stepped up towards the house. The door was ajar, the lock broken. All the lights in the house were off. The only cop present was at the bottom of the steps, facing away from me, squatting down as if examining some evidence on the ground. I called out to her as soon as I was in earshot. "Where's Charlie? Where's Charlie Sullivan?" I cast the question desperately into the air, terrified of the fresh nightmare its response might bring. "Sarah." The cop turned around at my question, but she wasn't the one who responded. As she turned to face me, rising back to her feet, the 7-year-old figure of Charlie Sullivan pushed past and started running up to me, tears that had become all too familiar streaming freely down his cheeks. I dropped down to the ground to meet him as he collapsed immediately into my arms, grasping me close and pressing his head into my shoulder. I begin to say, overwhelmed by relief, as I hear my mother arrive behind me, waiting patiently alongside the still gathering crowd. "It came inside and it took it." Charlie whimpers and erupts into a wail, his little arms squeezing me tighter. "Charlie?" I asked, as I stared up at the cop and over to the empty house. "Charlie, where's your father?" Charlie didn't answer. He just kept screaming into the cold November night, distressed, distraught, trapped in a horrible new world he didn't understand. As I wrapped one arm firmly around him, I used my free hand to uncrumple the newest poster, holding it close, reading the words that had been left for us. "Bad man's home. No windows, no doors, no light. You called for bad people. We're cruel, misbehaved. Bad people are coming. No returns once took. Boys and girls kept." I dropped the paper to the cold, damp ground, putting both my arms around Charlie, watching the cop walking back to her car. She reaches in and brings the receiver up to her mouth. Hey, it's Hatch, can you spare anyone for Wilt Avenue? Yeah, well, looks like we got a third one. Yeah, same as the others. It was only then, as my blinding focus ebbed away, and I started to become aware of my surroundings, that I noticed the distant noise of sirens, a few streets over, emanating from two separate directions. As the minutes passed, the sirens only grew quieter, their tragic song drowned out by a child's unending cries. Subscribe and please like, thanks for tuning in and listening.